We got people joining here. So this week, I think last week we kind of decided on the post-closing occupancy agreement is what we would look at today. I don't think that's going to take the full time. We've had some requests to go over the brokerage disclosure to buyer as well. So we'll look at that after the post-closing occupancy. But before we jump in, you guys have any questions related to those or anything else?
Jesse, can you go over that how you go over your contract to buy and sell?
Oh yeah, let's
I'll expose myself.
yeah, that's fine. Let's actually do that first since we finished up with the contract to buy and sell last week. So I'll just get, obviously we talk about it in this class for 8 hours or however many weeks we spent on it, right? And the truth is it's just not feasible to cover the contract at that level with your clients every time. And so, Jerry had asked if I would just kind of say, like, review, hey, how do you actually do this? And so I'll just kind of do it as if we were in person, as if I was meeting with my client. I'm not saying it's the right way to do it, but I have a lot of clients who I've worked with numerous times and they just kind of trust what I tell them. And so, in some cases, it's as easy as like, hey, I'm sending them an email with the closing date, the purchase price, any special terms, and that's it. Because I've worked with them before, they know, how things operate. They're investors or whatever. And so it's not always going to be this way. You're going to have some people who are, the engineer types, the attorney types, and they're going to want to read everything and review everything, right? You might have to go over it line by line. There are times when I've spent, over an hour with a client just going over the contract to buy and sell itself. But for most people, just this weekend, for instance, I was working with a new client. She's actually out of Florida and I've never worked with her before. And so I'll just kind of give you the quick rundown of what I do and how I review a contract with a new client who is at least comfortable with, the advice that I'm giving them and the phone calls that we've had up to that point and so on and so forth. Right. And so, if I was presenting this to a new client, I'll just kind of give you the rundown of how I would do that. Okay. So I always ask them to make sure that their name is spelled correctly, verify that they want to take title, how they, how we've got it written on the contract. Sorry, I got my phone blowing up here. Sellers' names should already be in there, legal description, right? All that stuff doesn't really need, I've already done that part on the back end, so they don't necessarily need to do that, right? I do ask them to review the inclusions, make sure that that's what they actually expect, that there's nothing different than what they want. If there's any exclusions that are listed, I will ask them to review that as well. Typically, there's not going to be any water rights, okay? I send them an email with all of the dates and deadlines. And so I don't go over these dates and deadlines in depth. The one thing that I will do is tell them, hey, if our offer gets accepted, then we need the earnest money within 3 days or 2 days or whatever my contract says. Okay. And then I'll hit the closing date just to make sure that, everyone's on the same page there. I'll review the price with them. So, hey, here's the price, everything else. And yes, this is missing a figure in it. So pay no attention to that, missing the earnest money. I took some stuff out for a class that I was teaching. So, but I will ask them to review the price, make sure the earnest money is what they expected, make sure they know whether we're asking for any seller concessions or not. And then if they've got a loan, we make sure that the loan is correct. Okay. Most of the stuff I jump over because I've already reviewed much of the contract with them via phone. Okay. I'll talk to them about title, right? Hey, the seller's going to pay the title commitment, assuming we've got this box checked. Owner's extended coverage, will or will not, who's going to pay for it. Honestly, in this market, I'm having my buyers pay for it if I'm representing the buyer, just because it's one of those things that can give you a little bit of a competitive edge. And it's $75, right? $80, whatever it is. Like it's not a big expense and it's worth it in my opinion. And so we do that as a way to try to make our offer more competitive. Okay. In most cases, we're not going to have an ILC or a survey. Now, if it's land, that might be different. Or if it's large acreage, you know, with a residence or something, that might be different. But typically, most of my contracts that I'm writing, my buyers don't care to have a survey done. I've already talked to them about inspections, and yeah, I've got 3 inspectors that you can use. Here's the date that it needs to be done by, right? In many cases, I don't have any due diligence documents. So typically, it's either not going to apply, or if it is, then I'll review what they are. You know, I see a lot of people who put a lot of things in the due diligence section that really don't need to be there. So you, do whatever you want there, but just know if your client is not going to object over what you've written here, there's no need to put them in there. Okay. 10.7 is important. If they have a property that they need to sell, then you put it there, unless your client is waiving the conditional sale deadline, which is generally not recommended. And if they do have to sell and you're waiving that conditional sale contingency, then you need to disclose it. Okay. But if they're not selling a property, nothing to review there. We've already talked about the source of water typically with the source of water addendum, so I don't need to review that there. Maybe a quick talk about lead-based paint. Hey, if it was built prior to 78, then the EPA recommends that we have it. Okay. Carbon monoxide alarms, a Colorado law. A lot of people do ask about the meth when we get to that section. And I just tell them, hey, if they know that it's been a meth lab, used as a meth lab, smoked meth in there, whatever, they have to disclose it unless it's been cleaned to state standards. If it's been cleaned to state standards, they don't have to. I don't go into detail as far as, well, the broker might. It's not clear under Colorado law whether the broker's protected, right? So I don't go into that level of detail. It's just, if they know that it's been used for a meth lab, or meth has been manufactured, smoked, cooked, whatever, that they need to disclose it unless it's been cleaned to state standards. And if they're worried about it, they could test for it. Okay. Closing instructions, right? Whether we have them or not, it's just a checkbox, no big deal. I do talk to them about transfer of title. So either we're getting a special warranty deed, which says the seller has not created any liens or clouds on title during their period of ownership, versus a general warranty deed, which says, you're protected from the time of closing all the way back to the beginning of time, right? And how our contract defaults to special warranty deed unless you've selected something else. Okay. And in a multiple offer, scenario, again, while I would love my client to have a general warranty deed, to make it a little more competitive, in many cases right now, I'm doing a special warranty deed. Okay. We're still going to get a title commitment. We're still going to look at it. Right. And if there's something that comes up later that was prior to the seller's period of ownership, the buyer just knows that they're going to be on the hook for it. Okay. And that very seldom happens. I think I've had 2 properties in 13 years that have had title related defects. So not a lot. It is a thing, but it's not very common. Okay. And one of those was from during the seller's period of ownership. The other was not. Okay. So let's see. Kevin, just going to ask about you. Yeah, so Kevin just said, hey, I was going to ask about special warranty deed versus general warranty deed in this market. Again, guys, there's really no right or wrong. We need to advise our clients of the pros and cons of each and let them decide. If they say, nope, got to have a general warranty deed, then check the box, right? They're your client. You're doing as they're directing you to do. Our job is to advise them and then let them decide. Okay. Any liens and encumbrances are going to be paid off at closing unless we've otherwise agreed to. I always hit the closing services fee because people confuse that with closing costs, right? And so in most cases, you're going to see half and half. Again, maybe in a hot market, you have the buyer paying the total closing services fee themselves. Doesn't have to be, but in many cases, we see half and half, right? And so the seller might look at that and go, whoa, I'm not paying half of the buyer's closing costs. I'm not agreeing to that. Well, that's not what this is. So I let them know, hey, this is just the fee that the title company charges to get the deal closed, to draft all the closing documents, disperse all the funds, and all those things. Okay. I also tell them, it's usually $350 to $400, and then split half and half, right? You're looking at $175 to $200. Okay. If there is a homeowner association, I will hit on status letter and record change fee. Generally speaking, again, maybe not in a hot market, but generally speaking, I'll have the seller pay for the status letter and the buyer pay the record change fee. So I hit on that, make sure they know that. Most of the other stuff in section 15 here is not going to apply, so nothing really to talk about there. Taxes will be prorated in most cases to the most recent mill levy and most recent assessed valuation. And so I kind of go over how that works, right? And so for 2021, your property taxes for 2021 are not due until until 2022. And so what happens is at closing, the title company is going to prorate taxes and say, hey, seller, you owned the property from January 1 until today, which is, April 20th, right? And so we're going to take, let's say that the property taxes were $2,000, total for the year. We're, about a third of the way through. So they'd be about a third of whatever $2,000 is, right? And so what's going to happen at closing is title is going to take whatever that money is. They're going to take that away from the seller and give that to the buyer, right? And then when the property tax bill comes due in 2022, the buyer's on the hook for the whole thing, whether taxes have changed or not. The seller has already credited their portion to the buyer, okay? So I'll cover that real quick just so that they know, hey, the seller is going to give you money for the time that they own the property, okay? Association assessments, same thing. Assuming there's no special assessments, there shouldn't be anything listed here. In most cases, seller is going to be responsible for any outstanding special assessments, right? All these other things will be prorated. I do talk to them about possession, particularly if there's a post-closing occupancy, how that's going to work, what that's going to look like, and then what the dollars per day fee is going to be if they fail to deliver possession after closing, right? And so, we need to make sure that that fee is sufficient to cover any delays, any expenses, costs, anything like that they have. So, $300 a day, is that going to cut it with respect to your moving truck and renting a hotel room and food and all this other stuff? Okay. Make sure that you got this checked or don't have it checked, depending on what your situation is. If there is a post-closing occupancy, make sure you've got that box checked and make sure that you've got the post-closing occupancy agreement done with your contract and executed by all parties when you go under contract, okay? I hit this just to make sure they know, hey, if one of our deadlines falls on a state or federal holiday or a weekend, is it going to extend or is it not? There's no right or wrong, right? I just tell them section 19, this is really like the what if, like what if it burns, what if it floods, what if it gets condemned, right? These are all the legal things that we hope never happen, but if they do, then we'll cross that bridge when we get there. They have a right to have the contract reviewed by an attorney. All right, if the seller is in default, if I'm representing the buyer and the seller's in default, I'll just tell them your remedy is specific performance or damages or both, right? Or if I'm the seller and the buyer defaults, then typically, assuming this box is not checked, that it's a liquidated damages contract, you keep the earnest money. Okay, it doesn't mean that the buyers are just going to roll over and give up their earnest money if they've defaulted. In some cases, we're still going to have to fight for it. But theoretically, if the buyer defaults, they're going to cough up their earnest money. If it had to go to court, first it would have to go to mediation, then it could go to arbitration or court. And at court, the losing party will get assigned to pay the winning party's legal fees in most cases. However, even though that's black and white in our contract, I'll tell you that doesn't always happen. This covers an earnest money dispute. Again, hopefully that doesn't happen. If it does, then we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Okay. As far as termination, we got to terminate by our dates and deadlines. If we're going to do it, it needs to be in writing. Okay. And then most of the rest of this stuff, I don't go too deep into any level of detail. Okay. If there's any special provisions, appraisal gaps, non-refundable earnest money, something like that, then I will review that to make sure that they truly understand what it is that we've written into the contract and the consequences of doing that. Okay. So that's less than a 15-minute rundown. You don't need to spend 8 hours talking about that contract with your clients anytime that you write an offer. Okay. So that's just my quick overview. you know, maybe a little more in depth for a first time buyer, maybe much less for a seasoned investor who I've worked with numerous times. We just know each other's systems, right? Like I literally will just send them an email and say, purchase price, closing date, any special terms, right? And that's it. If you sign this via DocuSign, I'm going to assume you don't have any questions. Otherwise, call me and let me know if you want me to change something. Okay. So any questions about that before we jump into the post-closing occupancy agreement? Doesn't have to be like anything near what we talk about in this class, right? The hope is that, you know, if you're diligent about doing your job and staying on top of your dates and deadlines and all that other stuff, that most of our contract is just not going to apply, right? All the what if crap, all the earnest money disputes and mediation and, you know, all that other garbage, like hopefully that just doesn't apply to your situation. Okay. And if you plan on that applying for your situation, then I don't know, go to a different brokerage. I don't want you here. Okay. So anyway, that's my process, not saying it's right or wrong, but it's certainly not the level of depth that we go into in these classes. Okay. All right, let's talk about post-closing occupancy agreement. So right at the top, it tells you that, you know, this form is only to be used for a term that cannot exceed 60 days. Okay. And the important piece here is that if, let's say right up front, you know that, hey, we're going to close today, April 20th, and the seller needs possession through May, June, July 20th, right? So 3 months, 90 days. Okay. Or 91 days, I think, if we have a 31-day month in there. So if that's the case, what we can't do is we can't use the post-closing occupancy agreement for the first 60 and then a separate lease for the next 30. Okay. If it's longer than 60 days, period, it needs to be a lease that they either get, you know, somewhere from themselves or preferably an attorney drafted lease. Okay. The reason that they have this 60-day period in here is because most residential mortgages contain a clause that says, you know, for an owner occupant, it says that you have to take possession of the property within 60 days of closing. Otherwise, the borrower would be in default and the lender can call the note due. Okay. So they can say, hey, you're in default. You need to pay us everything that we lent to you. So not a good position to be putting our sellers in, or our buyers rather, if the seller says, hey, I'm going to need 90. Like, okay, there's a way to do that, but it needs to be an attorney drafted lease. And the lender needs to know that, because either they need to say, no, we can't do that because this is an owner occupied loan, or, hey, I have a program that might be suitable for that. It may not just be the typical conventional, you know, whatever. Okay. So address that with the lender first. And if it's going to be longer than 60 days, we can't use this form. Okay. It needs to be an attorney drafted lease or a lease that the parties agree to themselves. If they're agreeing to it themselves, I would strongly recommend that you put something in writing that says, hey, I see that you just pulled this off the internet, right? Like, yes, leases exist on the internet, but I strongly recommend that you have it reviewed by an attorney, because you may still be required to pay that note in full if the bank figures out that you didn't occupy the property within 60 days. Okay. So, oh, someone have a question?
I do.
Okay.
What if the sellers do need 90 days and you can only give them the 60 days? Can you do a longer closing period? Like,
Yep.
Instead of 30-day or 45-day, can you make it a little bit longer?
Yep, you could do 60-day, 90-day, you know, the closing period, right? It can be as long as you want. Now, the maybe potential downside of that is that your buyer may not be able to lock their interest rate for their loan until you get to 30 days out, or sometimes lenders will lock it at 60 days, right? But most lenders will not lock a rate for anything longer than 60 days. And so having a 90-day closing might put the buyer at risk of having those interest rates shift, right? And killing your deal because now they don't qualify based on the rate, or the total monthly payment will be too high or whatever. And right now, right, a lot of sellers want a quick close so that they don't have to worry about whether whether the deal is going to close in 90 days, right? They want a 30-day close or less so that they know it's going to be closed, and then we can just rent it back for however long we need it. So is it possible? Yes. Totally okay to do that. Is it ideal? I don't know. Okay. Brandy chatted in and said, is there a Damien clause to use for a rent back longer than 60 days to put in the contract? The answer is no. Damien does not have a clause for that. And even if we asked him to, he would not write a clause for that, because there are issues with the way that brokers advise their client. And even if Damien drafts a clause, right, Damien is not a party to the mortgage agreement. Really, Colorado is not truly a mortgage state, right? We're a deed of trust state. So I use them interchangeably. So, but Damien is not a party to the deed of trust or the mortgage. And so even if Damien drafted a clause that the buyer and seller agreed to that says, hey, or even a short-term rental agreement or whatever that says, hey, seller, you can occupy the property for 90 days or 120 days or whatever, Damien has no authority to bind the lender to the terms of this post-closing occupancy that's longer than 60 days. Okay. So no, Damien will not draft that agreement. Okay. All right. So section 1 talks about the parties in the property. So the post-closing occupancy agreement is entered into between the buyer and the seller. One of the things that has come up several times in the last month is I've had brokers call me and they go, hey, the property is tenant occupied and the lease on the property goes, let's say, through the end of July. Okay. So lease goes through the end of July. The seller wants a 30-day closing and they just don't want to deal with the assignment of the leases. And so they say, well, can we just do a post-closing occupancy agreement whereby the seller gets to retain possession of the property from the date of closing through the end of July? Well, what's the problem with that?
The tenant is not a part of the contract between buyer and seller.
Yeah, the tenant is not a party to the post-closing occupancy agreement, right? This says that the parties to this post-closing occupancy agreement are the buyer and the seller. And so they go, well, why don't I just strike through the word seller and write tenant in there and, have it be the tenant? Well, the problem with that is that the tenant is not a party to the contract to buy and sell, right? And so now you may have an agreement with the tenant and the buyer, but it's affecting the terms of the contract to buy and sell, which is between the buyer and the seller. And so the tenant can't bind the seller to some agreement that the tenant has, right? There's no way to make that happen. And then the other thing is that there's all these other terms that have to do with the buyer and the seller, some of which really are not applicable to the tenant. And so the answer is no, you cannot just use the post-closing occupancy agreement if there's a tenant in place and say, hey, we don't want to deal with the assignment of the leases and the assignment of the security deposits and all that other stuff. No, you either need to push closing out or you just need to assign the leases and the security deposits. Why is that a hard thing to do? Yes, it takes a little bit of extra, paperwork, but doing a post-closing occupancy agreement is extra paperwork too, right? So why there's this, pushback from saying you can't use a post-closing occupancy agreement for a tenant, I don't know. It's mind-boggling to me, but the answer is no, it doesn't work. Okay. Obviously, you've got the legal description of the property, the known as street address. That all makes sense. Okay. This is the agreement, right? Buyer and seller entered into a contract to buy and sell, dated whatever. So this will be the date of the contract to buy and sell. Hopefully that's the same date as your post-closing occupancy agreement in most cases. Now it is possible that you may get, 3 weeks into your deal and you realize, hey, the seller is going to need to occupy the property for an extra 30 days. And the buyer says, hey, yep, no problem. Okay. And then you draft up a post-closing occupancy agreement at that point. But if you know that you're going to need it from day one, just do it. Even if it is $0 rent for the term of the post-closing, I still want you to have a post-closing occupancy agreement. Even if it is for one day, I want you to have a post-closing occupancy agreement. You'll understand why when we talk specifically about section 4, which is maintaining the property, okay? All of the terms of the contract are incorporated herein. And so if you see anywhere that there is a capitalized term, right? The buyer, the seller, the property, closing, what that's saying is we're taking those defined terms and we're sucking those into this contract and they have the same meaning, okay? And then if there's any conflict between this agreement and the contract, then this agreement controls, okay? So perfect example would be you've got a, if they fail to vacate, right, you've got that per diem fee here. Well, in the contract to buy and sell, you've also got one. And so if your contract to buy and sell says $200 per day, and this says $300 per day, then this would prevail, okay? So if there's some discrepancy between the two, then this agreement would control, okay? And then the other piece that is important is that this agreement, this post-closing occupancy agreement, is conditional upon closing. So if closing doesn't happen, then the seller and buyer is not on the hook to do anything listed here in this post-closing occupancy agreement, right? Seller's not obligated to do anything in this post-closing occupancy agreement. It's just as if this agreement never happened, okay? Possession. So the seller can retain possession of the property from the date of closing through whatever date, okay? Now, the important piece here is that there's really nothing in this agreement that says what time on that date. And, if you read the language in our contract, right, days end at 11:59 p.m. per our contract. And so this is one of the reasons why I hate this contract is that, nobody's going to be out there handing over keys at 11:59 p.m. And so if you're not going to do that, then you need to not only write the date, but also write the time in there, okay? Because if we say, hey, the seller is going to retain possession of the property from the date of closing through April 20th, well, then really they have possession all the way through April 20th up until 11:59 p.m. And then the buyers can get the keys at midnight. What? Who does that, right? So put in here, April 20th at noon or April 20th at 5 p.m. or 10 a.m. or whatever the time is, right? Put both a date and a time here so that it's clear that we're not talking about 11:59 p.m. Nobody's going to be out there at midnight handing over keys, okay? Again, it tells you that it is not to exceed 60 days. And whatever you write in here becomes the term, and that is a capitalized term, okay? And that's going to be important because our post-closing occupancy agreement has changed this year, I believe. And what it used to say is that rent would be at a rate of X number of dollars per day. And now it doesn't say per day or per month. What it says is rent will be, and it's right down here, it says rent for the term will be X number of dollars for the entire term, okay? And so what has happened in a couple times that I've seen is people think, oh, we'll put, let's say $1,500, and they're thinking, oh, it's $1,500 per month, but it's a 60-day post-closing occupancy agreement, right? And so they're thinking it's $3,000, but the way that it reads is that rent for that entire 60-day term is $1,500, not $3,000. Okay, and it's not per day either. So be careful about that. You want to make sure that you understand that the term is the whole thing and that rent is for the whole term, not per month or per day or any other unit of time. Okay.
So Jesse,
Yep.
in this environment that we're in where people are doing $0 post-occupancy agreements, that obviously would just be 0.00, right?
Yeah, for that section, yes. There are other sections that we'll talk about that you may actually put a dollar amount in there. So the security deposit and the per diem fee. even if you're doing $0, I typically recommend doing both a security deposit and a per diem fee if they fail to vacate, right? There are, I just closed a deal where I was on the listing side, the seller side, and we had a post-closing occupancy agreement from our buyer that was not only 0 rent, but also 0 post-closing and 0 per diem fee as well. That's a really stupid thing to do. If you're going to do that, there's no point in writing a post-closing occupancy agreement. Now, you might write a post-closing occupancy agreement with no security deposit, but if nothing else, write a per diem fee in there, right? It costs the seller nothing to have a per diem fee in there unless they go over, right? But if they go over and their penalty is 0, you're just taking it in the shorts until they decide to move out, right? So have a per diem fee in there if nothing else, and probably a good idea to get a security deposit as well. Okay.
Hey, Jesse, this is
Yes.
Jill. I think I know the answer, but
Okay.
what would happen if someone did do a 60-day close, and then the seller did not move out and did not vacate when they were supposed to? Would that mess with the loan at all?
Well, I mean, the hope, and there's no guarantee, but the hope is you explain the consequences to the lender and say, hey, this was our agreement. We tried to, do it per the books, right? And make a 60-day deal. And now all of a sudden they're not moving out. Like, this is why we're in this situation. This is how this happened. I'm not trying to, scam you to make you believe that I was an owner occupant, but I'm really an investor or something, right? Like, the hope is that there's some forgiveness there, but absolutely there doesn't have to be if the lender wants to, enforce the terms of the loan. Now, historically, as interest rates had been dropping for a long time, right? If the lender has a mortgage on a property at, let's say, 5%, right? And at least they're getting payments on it. And in the meantime, interest rates have dropped to 4%. Now they're 3% or whatever, right? There's no reason for them to call the note due as long as they're getting their payments, because if they call that note due, they're going to take that money, turn around and lend it out at 3% instead of 5%. And that's a really stupid thing for them to do. However, what have we seen recently with rates? Are they still going down? No, rates are starting to go up, right? And so if you have a loan that was locked in at 2.5% at closing, right? And now your rates are at 3.5% or 4% or whatever they end up climbing up to. And the lender figures out, hey, you've defaulted under the term of the loan, right? You haven't occupied it within 60 days. Now I can call this note due that I was lending to you at 2.5%, and I can take that and turn it around and lend it out at 4%. There's a lot of incentive for them to do that. Okay. And so I don't expect that it's going to be terribly forgiving moving forward. Okay, as rates continue to rise, we're in a period where it makes sense for a lender to call the note due, even if they're getting their payments on time. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, yep, you bet. Someone else, I think, had a question.
Just real quick, one of the things I've noticed lately is, let's say today was April 20th and you got 60 days and you put June 20th.
Yeah.
And you're thinking that's 2 months, when in reality it's 61 days.
Correct.
So really,
yep. You got to be super careful when you've got those months with 31 days in there.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe no big deal when we're talking about February, but when you've got a month with 31 days in there, you got to be careful, because you could allow the seller. Do you think the seller cares about whether you're going to occupy the property within 60 days?
No.
Nope. So if you're going to give them 61 and they need it, they're going to take it, right? So you got to be really careful about counting how you count it, right? The day of closing doesn't count. It's 60 days after closing, okay? So closing, and then the next day starts your 1. And so if you need to go to a calendar and count out 60 days to make sure, right, then go count 60 days. But yeah, you do need to be careful when you've got a 31-day month in there, that you're not just going from the 20th to 20th, 60 days later, because it's 61. Okay. All right, so that defines our term, whatever is there. However, the seller may cause an earlier termination upon 5 days written notice to buyer. Now, you might think that that's not important, particularly when it's a $0, rent for the term type situation. The reason that that becomes important is because when it comes to maintaining the property, right, there are certain things that the buyer, who effectively becomes a landlord, the buyer essentially becomes responsible for, just like a landlord would typically be responsible for, right? So maintaining and repairing heating, cooling, HVAC, ducts, plumbing, electrical wiring, right? The mechanical systems of the property, they become responsible for maintaining as the buyer, even though the seller still lives in there. Okay. And so the reason that this is important, even if it's a 0-day deal, okay, is that if they give 5 days written notice to the buyer, then the seller becomes off the hook for those things, even if they had the right to stay in the property for longer, right? Then the seller is off the hook, assuming they've delivered proper written notice to the buyer. Okay. Now, the place where this gets a little bit weird is there is a section that talks about rent, right? And let's say we're not doing a $0 rent for the term. Let's say that we're doing $2,500 rent for let's say a 30-day period, okay? And here we say that the rent will or will not be prorated and refunded to the seller, okay? So if the seller 10 days into the deal says, hey, buyer, I tell you what, I can be out in 5 days. So on, let's say from the first of the month, right? Let's say, we have 15 days. We're closing on the 1st. We have through the 15th, or really it would be the 16th, but just play along. We're going with the 15th. Okay. So I have until the 15th, I have until the 30th rather, but on the 10th day, I say I can get out on day 15, right? Even if that rent will not be refunded to the seller, right? It doesn't matter, right? The $2,500 is still going to be gone, even if it's not refundable. However, the seller is no longer on the hook for these things because they've caused it to terminate, and therefore the the buyer becomes responsible for those things. Okay. On the flip side, if rent is, able to be returned and prorated, then that would, you still need to give the 5 days written notice, and then you'll still be on the hook for those next 5 days worth of rent, right? But then those last 15 days you're not responsible for. Okay, does that make sense to everybody?
So just to check, will be, who's responsible? I mean, if you're representing the buyer, you're responsible to make sure the buyer, who's responsible to ensure that happens?
To make sure what happens, that it gets
like if
terminated?
Some of it is prorated and refunded to the seller.
So who's responsible for determining the proration?
No, making sure the seller gets it back.
Well, technically this is between the buyer and the seller, right? Now, if you look at our exclusive right to buy and our exclusive right to sell, the brokers are obligated to see the transaction through closing. Exactly. or anything else that really comes up with the deal. And so technically the brokers still have some liability here. And I think when the exclusive right to buy and sell get updated next, they're really only supposed to be updated every 3 years, unless there's a legislative change that forces it to be updated, in less than 3 years. But I think the next time that our exclusive right to buy and sell get updated, they're going to make it more clear that brokers are still responsible for seeing everything through to the end of the deal, not necessarily the end of closing, right? And so you still have some liability here, even though it's not very clearly worded that way in the current exclusive right to buy and sell. right? There's talk about them revising that to make it very clear that yes, you are still obligated. You were still a part of this deal. This was still something that you helped them negotiate. So you get to see it through to the end. Okay. That being said, it's really between the buyer and seller.
Right.
And so buyer and seller need to make sure that everything is being done properly. And if they've been advised properly, then hopefully it's just not a problem. Okay.
But Jesse, doesn't this post-occupancy agreement become part of the contract?
Well, it should, right? You've got a checkbox that says, you know, buyer and seller have agreed to enter into post-closing occupancy agreement. And so again, assuming that box is checked, then yes, effectively this becomes part of that agreement. And
Which puts us still into the game, right?
well, again, like if you look at the exclusive right to buy and sell, it says that we have the obligation to see it through to closing.
Mhm.
And it's
Okay.
not very clear that that does still include, right, a post-closing occupancy period, or, you know, if a lawsuit happens down the road after closing, that you still have to cooperate with that and be involved in that and all that other stuff, right? But since you brought it up, you know, I keep hammering this point home of like, if you know you're going to have a post-closing occupancy agreement, do it with your contract. And here's why. So we had a broker who is no longer with our office, but what they did was they were working with a seller, and buyer's agent comes along and writes this offer, and they, in their email, they said, hey, you know what, we are more than happy to do a post-closing occupancy agreement. They checked the little box that says, yes, the post-closing occupancy agreement's part of this, but they didn't actually negotiate the terms up front, right? And so they're like a week away from closing, and the seller goes, hey, we should probably figure out the terms of this post-closing occupancy agreement, right? And the phone calls and the emails that were exchanged basically made it sound like the buyer was willing to just give them however long they needed for free. Well, when it came time to hammer it out, our, you know, former broker who was representing the seller calls up the buyer's agent and says, okay, hey, we're going to need 3 weeks of post-closing occupancy. And the buyer's agent goes, okay, no problem. I'll run it by my buyer. Talks to the buyer, you know, is like, okay, yeah, that's fine. They can have 3 weeks, no problem. We'd like $250 per day and a $5,000 security deposit. It was like, oh, but hold on, you guys made it sound like you were willing to do these 3 weeks for free, but now you're wanting $250 per day times 21, you do the math, right? And a $5,000 security deposit, and this was a $300,000 house. You got to be kidding me, right? And so seller said, well, if that's the case, we're going to treat you buyers in bad faith because you checked the box that said that the post-closing occupancy agreement was going to be part of the contract. You led us on to believe that it was going to be free. We don't have a post-closing occupancy agreement. Therefore, we believe that the contract is void because that was never entered as a part of our contract. We're missing pieces of our agreement, right? And so, no, we're not going to sell you the property. Well, buyers sued the seller for specific performance. Sellers had to go get attorneys involved. Everything else ends up costing them tens of thousands of dollars because the broker didn't do a post-closing occupancy agreement with the contract, right? So yes, it should become a part of the contract if that box is checked. And again, there might be some circumstances later that would require you to have a post-closing occupancy agreement that you didn't think you would need up front. And as long as all the parties are amicable, right, you can always do one later. But if you know you're going to need it up front and you check the box saying, yes, it's going to be a part of my contract, then do it with the contract. Okay. All right. Where did we leave off here? So seller can cause the earlier termination with 5 days written notice. Notice has to be provided to the address, fax, or email of the recipient. Seller agrees to use the property for the seller's occupancy and personal residence only. That doesn't mean that they can sublease some of the rooms, right? Doesn't mean that they can use it as a short-term rental for those 60 days. Doesn't mean that they can have, you know, their cousin who's couch hopping or their buddy who's couch hopping move in and occupy the property with them for that 60 days. Right? It's the seller's personal residence only. Okay. The seller's rights and obligations cannot be transferred or assigned in whole or in part. That just means they can't say, hey, I have 60 days, I'm going to sublease it out, right? The rights and remedies of the party under this agreement will survive this agreement, right? And so if there are rights that survived the end of the term, then those rights would survive this agreement, right? That's particularly having to do with maintenance and stuff, right? If the furnace goes out 1 day before the end of the post-closing occupancy agreement or something like that, right? Then that would survive, even though it's towards the very end and the contract might expire, or that term expires the next day, right? The rights under the contract would still prevail, okay? All right, maintenance of the property. So again, buyer is going to be responsible for maintaining those things that a landlord would typically maintain, because they are effectively becoming a landlord for a short period of time. And so that would be things like, you know, the mechanical systems, HVAC, plumbing, electrical, all of those things, and all of the appliances in the property that become owned by the buyer at closing, as well as the sprinkler system, as long as those items were functioning or working on the day of closing, right? Now, in some cases, you might have an HOA that maintains landscaping and whatever, right? Condos, that type of thing. But aside from that, if there is no HOA or some other third party maintaining those things, the seller still has obligations as well. So the seller still needs to maintain the property as they had previously maintained the property, including things like landscaping, snow removal, lawn care, and those types of things, right? Now, if there is something that becomes broken or needs attention or whatever, then the seller, as the occupant, needs to provide timely notice to the buyer of any improvements that require maintenance or repair. And probably that should be done in writing, right? Just so that there's a record of, hey, this broke today, it needs to get fixed. And right, a phone call is hard to prove. Like you could use phone records and say, hey, I called you on that day, but what if you called him about something else? Okay, so again, it should be in writing. If something breaks, seller needs to notify the buyer. Obviously, if it was something the buyer was required to maintain, landscaping, snow removal, lawn care, those are things that don't typically break. But maybe you have like a tree that you know, is damaged or something like that. Who does that fall on? Well, you could make an argument either way. Is that included in landscaping or is it not? I mean, yeah, I would say that trees are typically part of the landscape, but that's probably not typically going to be a tenant responsibility. That's typically probably going to be a landlord responsibility to clear any downed limbs and whatever else that get broken as part of a snowstorm or something. Okay, so this is not a, you know, again, it doesn't provide for all circumstances. It is not a great agreement, in my opinion. I'm not a fan of post-closing occupancy agreements. Yes, I absolutely still use them, but there's still a lot of vagueness and gray area in this agreement, right? It's only 3 pages, whereas a typical lease maybe 12 pages, 15 pages. Our contract is 20 pages, okay? Section 5 talks about damage to the property. So during that term, however long the term is, the seller at the seller's sole expense needs to keep the improvements as well as any personal property that becomes owned by the buyer in the same condition and repair as of the date of closing, with normal wear and tear accepted, right? Now, normal wear and tear doesn't mean you can go beat holes in the wall and, you know, drag your muddy shoes across the carpet and everything else. But if it was brand new at the time of closing, right? Brand new carpet got installed right before closing, it's going to have a little bit of wear and tear after 60 days. Hopefully it's not anything major, right? And if they spilled wine on the carpet and it's stained now, then yeah, they're probably going to have to replace it. Okay. That's not normal wear and tear, but it may not be brand new. It may be slightly more used than, you know, the time of closing. That's okay. Okay. However, the seller is responsible for misuse, waste, neglect, damage to the property or the personal property that is owned by the buyer, or any damage that's caused by anyone who the seller invites over after closing or their family, right? And so even though up here we said that, you know, the seller would be the only one who could occupy the property, and the entire family is not listed on the contract and not listed in the post-closing occupancy agreement, and it doesn't say up here that their family can use it, right? Which I hope is something that gets changed, because if it's just let's say my wife and I who are on the contract and we're the only parties who are allowed to occupy the property during the term, what the heck am I supposed to do with my kids, right? Well, they picked up on that down here in section 5 and said if my family damages something or anyone else who I invite over, then I would be responsible for it, okay? However, seller's not responsible for any damage that's not caused by the seller or the seller's family and invitees, right? And so again, like a downed tree limb is a perfect example. What happens if it falls on the, covered patio and it smashes through the overhang? Well, the seller did not cause that to be done. Is that part of the landscaping? Well, the tree is, but the damage of the house isn't. And I would argue that the tree is not the tenant's responsibility anyway. Okay. So any questions about 4 or 5 there? Okay. Section 6 talks about buyer access to the property. So what section 6 says is that if the buyer gives the seller not less than 24 hours prior notice, they can have access to the property at all reasonable times. Now, it doesn't mean that they can go over at 11 o'clock at night, right? But they can have access at all reasonable times, or their designee could, right? If they have a property management company or someone like that doing it for them, then they can enter the property. What does that mean with respect to keys at closing?
Everyone has one.
Yeah. Buyer needs to get a copy of the key at closing, which is probably a little bit uncomfortable for the sellers, right? But if the sellers don't like that, then they need to change that. And if they agree to the terms of the post-closing occupancy agreement, then that's what they agree to. If the buyer gives them 24 hours notice, the buyer can access the property at all reasonable times, okay? The caveat there is if there's some kind of emergency, buyer doesn't need to give the seller 24 hours notice, right? If the basement's flooding, right, neighbors, or let's say the sellers go on vacation and the neighbors call up and say, hey, the property's flooding, someone should probably get in there and shut off the water. Well, buyer can absolutely go in and shut off the water, right, and get things moving to get it corrected, okay?
Hey, Jesse.
But, yeah.
So if you have the seller and they've entered into a post-closing occupancy agreement to continue to live there, do you let them know that the buyer is going to need the keys at closing? I mean, do you set all that up in advance?
So I always warn my sellers that, hey, this is the case, right? And the buyer does have the right to do it. However, I never tell the other agent that if I'm representing the seller, because most brokers don't know that that clause exists within the post-closing occupancy agreement, because what do? They go look for check boxes and blanks and they fill them in and they don't actually read the thing, right? And so they don't know that the buyer has a right to have the key at closing. And so they just don't ever get one, okay? So I don't ever tell the other broker, and I don't ever try to, if I'm representing the seller, I don't ever try to force the, buyer to get a key at closing or force the seller to turn over a key at closing, right? If they're not going to be astute enough to know what's in their contract, then I'm not going to put my seller in that position either. But I absolutely am going to warn them of what's in the contract that they're signing. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Restoration. So again, buyer has the right. Oh, hold on, we got a chat here. So I also make sure to get contact info. Yeah. So Brandy chatted and said, yep, make sure that buyers and sellers get contact info for each other. Sometimes brokers are a little bit hesitant because they're like, oh, I don't want you having access to my client's, phone number and email address and whatever else. I don't care. Like, have buyer and seller exchange it on a sticky note at closing, but at some point they're going to need it, right? And particularly for the final walkthrough, which, while we're talking about walkthrough, I'll just hit this, right? So really the best thing that I can advise you to do when there is a post-closing occupancy agreement in place is go take a video of the property at the time of closing, right? And then at the final walkthrough, go do a video of the property as well. Because if there's some dispute where the buyer comes in and they say, hey, whoa, that wasn't there when, you know, we closed on the property, and so you have to restore it. Well, if you have video evidence, it's going to be much easier to refute. Okay. So is that your responsibility? Is it the seller's responsibility? Both. I don't know. Right. But somebody should do it. Really, the seller, in my opinion, should be the one motivated enough to take a video of their own property so that they don't hopefully get stuck for it later. However, I could see an argument where the seller says, hey, listing broker, you didn't advise me that I needed to do that. And now the buyers are claiming that there's damage that existed at the time when we closed, and they're trying to get me to pay for it. If you would have advised me to take a video at the time of closing, I would have done it, and we could have gotten out of this mess right from the beginning. But here I am in court, and so now I want you to you know, cover the cost of these things and whatever else. So Melissa chatted in, she said, for walkthroughs in general, what about damage that was behind or under furniture that the buyers only see once all of the seller's possessions are out? So that's a good question. So that would be considered an adverse material fact, which the seller had an obligation to disclose to the buyers from the beginning. And if they chose not to disclose that, if they chose to hide it, then the seller should be on the hook for effectively concealing an adverse material fact about the property. Okay. So not a good idea, right? I've been in plenty of college rentals where like the college students hang up posters, right? And as you're walking through, sometimes the buyers are like, oh, I wonder if there's anything behind the poster, or like the hippie tapestry that's hanging up on the wall or whatever else, right? And they look behind there and it's like a body went through the wall. Well, you shouldn't cover that up, right? Maybe for photos, but make sure that it's clear that, hey, it's there. And the seller's probably going to be on the hook for repairing it. Okay. Now, sellers will fight you on it too. Okay. But bottom line is, if they're covering it up with posters or furniture or whatever else, and the buyer didn't know about it, then the seller is going to have to be on the hook for it. Okay. Okay, so buyer has the right, but not the obligation to restore the property and any items of personal property owned by the buyer to the same condition or repair the claim that existed as date of contract. Obviously, normal wear and tear is accepted. And if the seller is responsible for such damage, right, pursuant to section 4 and 5 that we talked about, then the seller will pay the buyer, in addition to the rent that they're paying, the cost of the repair or the replacement. Right. So if the seller is responsible for maintaining something and they damage it, or, you know, it needs to be repaired or whatever, the seller doesn't just get to say, well, you know, the post-closing occupancy is over tomorrow and I'm just going to be off the hook for it. No, seller is still going to be responsible for it. Doesn't matter when it expires, right? They're liable for that damage. Okay. Additionally, the buyer may apply the seller's security deposit towards the cost of those repairs or replacements. And that's part of why that security deposit is important, even if rent for the term is going to be 0. Okay. It's much easier to just take money from their security deposit. Now that you have to have a right to take it. You can't just say, hey, sucks to be you. You know, I'm keeping your $1,500 or whatever the security deposit was. You got to actually show that, you know, prove that there was some damage that was caused by the seller or their family or their guests or whatever. But it's much easier to simply take money out of their security deposit than it is to try to go after them after the fact. Okay. That's part of why it's important to have that security deposit. Yeah, go ahead.
That's what I was going to ask you is, typically, what is this amount of dollars of the security deposit that you typically assign? Is it a percentage of what the home sold for, or?
Yeah, good question. So the answer is it's negotiable, right? There's no right or wrong. In a hot market, the security deposit might be 0, right? However, let's talk about a normal market, right? In many cases, what I want to see is I want the security deposit to be equal to approximately 1 month of my buyer's mortgage payment. Now, what if it's a cash buyer? Well, if it's a cash buyer, then figure out approximately what a mortgage payment would cost on a house in that, price range. And that's what I would do, right? Does it have to be that? No, absolutely not. You could do $1,000, you could do $1,500, you could do zero, right? But it's negotiable between the parties. There's no right or wrong. Okay.
But do you maintain that even in a hot market, it's still wise to get a security deposit?
Yeah, but again, like your job is to advise the buyer, right? Not make the decision for them. Your job is to advise them. And so, we're talking about two opposite ends of the spectrum. They can't have their cake and eat it too. Mm-hmm. Do you want to protect yourself from the perspective of having a security deposit and make that attractive for you? Or do you want to make your offer more attractive in hopes that your offer gets accepted? If your offer doesn't get accepted, it doesn't matter what the security deposit amount was because you didn't get the property, right? And then let them decide. You advise them of the pros, you advise them of the cons, right? What do they want to do? And it doesn't have to be the full amount of their mortgage payment. Maybe their mortgage payment is $2,700 and you do $1,000 security deposit or $500 security deposit or whatever else, right? So again, coach your buyer, ask them what they want, or if you have the seller, right, maybe you try to negotiate it down to zero, whatever works best for you, okay? We already talked about Section 8 otherwise. Compliance with law. So this is one of my favorite. So during the term, the seller agrees to abide by all federal, state, and local laws. So what is unique about today, particularly in Colorado, where we have state laws that are in opposition to federal laws?
Mary Jane.
Yep, today's 420, right? So seller agrees to abide by all federal laws. You know what that means? Means they can't smoke pot in the property. Okay. So they need to abide by all federal, state, and local laws, as well as any applicable HOA stuff, right? They can't do something that would cause the homeowners association to place a lien against the property. Seller agrees that they, will not store or use any hazardous material on the property other than those materials customarily used or stored for a residential home, right? So, yes, most homes have some form of hazardous materials in them. But we're not talking about explosives, and we're not talking about meth, and we're not talking about all that other stuff, right? If it's not customarily used for a residential home, then they need to go put it somewhere else. If they have an in-home business that uses, large quantities of hazardous materials, then that they need to go find somewhere else for that, because they're not customarily used for a residential home. It doesn't say materials that were customarily used for this home, right? It says those materials that are customarily used or stored for a residential home. Okay.
Jesse, who's responsible for enforcing those rules?
Well, I mean,
the seller?
Again, the buyer and seller the buyer and seller are the parties to the contract, and so they need to, they mutually have liability and responsibilities under the terms of the contract. So what happens if the seller has hazardous materials on the property that they weren't supposed to have? Well, the seller is going to be the one who's going to have to, go through mediation. And if that doesn't work, go to court or whatever. Right. And is it worth it or is it not? Well, I don't know. It depends on what the materials are. Okay. So, again, this is one of those areas where if you coach your sellers, if you're working with the seller, coach the seller, say, hey, you can't have those materials here during the term of the post-closing occupancy unless you strike through Section 9 or, have some provision that says, hey, seller uses hazardous materials as part of their in-home business, and so they need to have the right to keep those hazardous materials on the property. That's okay, right? You can change it, but if it just gets agreed to as it is, and you didn't read it, you didn't advise your client as to what's in here, right? Then the terms of the post-closing occupancy agreement are what are going to be enforced, okay? Failure to vacate. So again, if the seller doesn't timely deliver possession of the property, then they'll be liable to the buyer for X number of dollars per day. Again, even if your security deposit and your rent is zero, it doesn't cost the seller anything to have $100 a day or $500 a day or $1,000 per day in here if they get out on time, right? Now, if they know that they might bump up against, you know, some potential delays, right? What very common right now with new construction. So someone says, hey, we're supposed to close in, you know, on our new build in 2 months. We need 60 days of post-closing, right? Have you guys seen new construction getting delayed right now? Like, new construction is getting delayed for so many reasons right now, including the lack of availability of appliances to get into the property, right? And so, you know, you may not think that you need it. And so it may be something that the seller is still interested in just in case they do bump up against some delays. But if they plan on being out when they say they plan on being out, then hopefully this, regardless of what you put in here, should be inconsequential, right? And how many of you guys have seen, if you're part of Lab Coat Agents, I think it's Lab Coat Agents, the California story with the person who bought the property. I think it was like over a year ago. And I think it was actually the seller. I don't think it was a homeless person. I think the seller just refused to leave. And California is like worse than Colorado when it comes to tenant rights. And basically California said, yeah, we're really sorry, buyer, go screw yourself. Like, we're just going to let your dude live in the property. And in the meantime, the seller has to make mortgage payments and everything else. And seller's not paying him any rent. And there was nothing the seller could do to kick this guy out. Well, maybe there was some oversight on behalf of the broker. And the broker actually chimed in on the broker who was involved in that deal actually chimed in on some of the threads on Lab Coat Agents and said, hey, there was no oversight. I did everything to a T, the way that it was supposed to be done, everything else. And I don't know what California is like, guys. I mean, I know enough to know enough. But, you know, at least in Colorado's contract, right, we have this per day penalty where if they fail to get out of the property, then we can hit them with that penalty. And, you know, maybe $50 a day is comfortable as a penalty for the seller to say, hey, that's fine. That's cheaper than me going and buying somewhere else. So yeah, I'll take your $50 a day and I'll just continue living here for $50 a day, right? So it needs to be painful enough that you've got some leverage. I say painful enough, if you're representing the buyer, it needs to be painful enough for the seller that you have a lot of leverage to get them out of the property because they don't want to get stuck with that fee. Okay, so that fee would go from per day from and after the term until after possession is delivered to the buyer, in addition to any other damages that a court might award. And so you may have damages which are attorney's fees and court costs, and you know, we had to rent another home in the meantime and all these other things, right? The per day penalty is in addition to those. Okay. Water, sewer, electric, gas. So in most cases, title is going to transfer water to the buyer at the time of closing. The reason for that is water is a lienable item, and as part of the title company's title policy, they are ensuring that there are no liens against the property. And so what they do is they get the final reading, right? They make sure that the seller gets charged for the final reading, and then the buyer, that's going to get transferred into the buyer's name so that there's no question there was no water lien at the time of closing, right? Or anything else that came up afterwards. Okay. So you can check the seller box here, but you're going to have to get creative as to how that happens. In some cases, title will send a note along with the water transfer form that effectively says, hey, even though we closed on this one, the buyer's not going to take possession until, you know, July 20th or whatever. You know, please don't transfer it during, until July 20th. But in most cases, most water providers, the admin people that receive those forms suck at doing their jobs and they transfer it anyway. Okay. So you may have to get a little bit creative if you want the seller to pay for water and sewer. Is there some risk associated with having the buyer pay? Yeah, there is. Any of you guys up north pay attention to what's going on in Wellington with water right now? Anybody seen that? So residential rates for water in Wellington have like skyrocketed lately. Okay. And part of the reason is they've been under collecting for like 20 years. And now that they're seeing this explosion in growth, it's like, okay, now we have this problem on our hands where we aren't going to have enough water for our residents unless we can go buy more water, right? And so what they're doing is they're effectively slamming residents with these crazy high water rates, right? Their base fee is like crazy high. I don't even know what their base fee is. But then on top of that, the dollar amount per gallon above their base rate is just nuts. And so your water bill for like a very normal family is like $350 a month, $400 a month. Okay. So your buyer might be taking on some significant costs, right? And I'm not saying it doesn't happen elsewhere too, but particularly right now, Wellington is having like a water crisis, okay? And so you need to know the consequences of having the buyer pay for that, okay? Now, electric and gas doesn't typically get transferred at closing, right? And so in that case, I would typically ask the seller to pay for the electric and gas. Because they're going to be living there, they're going to be the ones using it. It makes sense for them to pay for it. That being said, if there's a checkbox in our contract, it means that it's negotiable, right? And in a hot market, maybe one of the things you do to make it attractive is, hey, we're going to pay your utility bills for the term of the post-closing occupancy agreement. Okay. Let's see, the seller's renter's insurance policy. So again, this is a section that changed from this form is new as of 2021. The previous version had two different types of insurance, right? One said, is the seller going to maintain hazard insurance, which is like homeowner's insurance? And the other one said, is the seller going to maintain renter's insurance? Well, they've taken out the hazard insurance because that was just getting into problems, because it was like, no, we're not going to insure you for a property that you don't own. And even if the seller continued with their insurance policy, in many cases, what was happening was the seller was not notifying their insurance company that they had sold the home. And so even though they continued paying their premiums and hadn't canceled the policy yet, the insurance company was going, well, you're not the owner of the home anymore, and that's not covered under our policy. And so the claim was getting denied when there were issues, okay? And so now they've taken it out. Hazard insurance just needs to become the responsibility of the buyer. Okay. And then either the seller will or will not maintain and pay the cost of a seller's rental policy and give the buyer evidence that they have that insurance at or before closing, if applicable. Okay. So a renter's policy effectively is contents insurance. It covers your personal property that remains in the home, right? And if you agree that your seller is going to maintain and pay the cost of a renter's policy, you need to supply the buyer with evidence that you've got that renter's policy at or before closing. And that's not happening in many cases. The brokers are not advising their sellers that they need to go get a renter's policy. And so they're not doing it, and you get to closing and they don't have it. Okay. So that's a problem, and it's creating problems at closing. So know how that affects everything. If you're on the buyer side, you might make sure, a couple weeks before closing that you're getting on the listing broker and the seller saying, hey, we need you to provide us with proof that you've got that renter's policy at or before closing, so that hopefully they know, right? Hey, we need to go get this. It's something we need to do. It's something that needs to be in place by the time we close. Seller agrees to reimburse buyer for buyer's reasonable attorney's fees and hold the buyer harmless for any injury, loss, all yada, 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 all that legal stuff, okay? Buyer's insurance policy. So again, buyer agrees now to maintain and pay the cost of the owner's property insurance policy, which they may need to talk to their insurance company because their typical homeowner's insurance policy may not cover them as a landlord. So again, if you're working the buyer side, the buyer is also going to need to talk to their insurance company and make sure that they know what's going on and make sure that they have a policy that will cover them as the landlord for the term of the post-closing before flipping into a typical homeowner's insurance policy. Okay. All right, that's security deposit. So seller agrees that the security deposit will be however much you write here. Again, there's no right or wrong. It's negotiable. Do whatever works for buyer and seller there. It will be paid at closing and held by the buyer. Okay. So seller does need to have those funds available because the buyer can, in fact, take that and deposit that money. Now, what I typically tell my buyers is, hey, just hang on to the check, right? Don't deposit it. And then assuming everything works out at the end of the post-closing occupancy period, then you're just going to shred the check or void it or give it back. Now, I will say the risk associated with doing that is what happens if they cut you a check at closing and then the next day they go shut that bank account down and now you're trying to go cash a check or deposit a check on a bank that on an account that has no funds in it. Okay, so there is some risk. So buyer does certainly have a right to deposit it. Hopefully, there's no issues anyway, but not a bad idea to have the buyer deposit it. I just typically don't, but I do advise the buyer of the risks of doing it. The other piece though is if they do deposit that, then they need to make sure that they don't spend it because it's going to be returnable to the seller or the tenant, assuming everything works out. So they can't just put the $2,500 deposit in their bank account and use it to go to Disneyland. It doesn't work that way. And that's why I sometimes advise my buyers, depending on who they are, is like, don't even cash it, because if you do, then you're going to have problems, right? If you spend that money and you have to refund it and you don't have it later, that's a problem. So know and understand the risks associated with either way, right? There's pros and cons of both. Parties agree that the security deposit will be dispersed within 30 days after the term in accordance with Colorado law. So it doesn't mean that the security deposit has to be handed over at the end of the term. And if that's what the buyers were expecting to happen, then you need to change that. And changing that, I don't know whether it would be enforceable in court because Colorado law says you have 30 days. Okay. So just advise the buyer they may not get that security deposit back until up to 30 days after the term expires.
Seller, you mean?
Yes, that's what I mean. Thank you. The seller may not get their deposit back until after 30 days. Okay. So buyer could hang on to it for 30 days after expiration. Attorney's fees and costs, anything in the contrary, unless there's some other provision elsewhere, if there's any arbitration or litigation relating to the agreement, then the court will award prevailing party all reasonable costs and expenses, including attorney's fees, yada, yada, right? And again, even though it's black and white in our contract, sometimes it doesn't happen that way, okay? But that's what's supposed to happen. Additional provisions, you'll notice it's blank, right? Following additional provisions have not been approved by the Real Estate Commission. Anything you write in there may or may not be enforceable. It certainly hasn't been reviewed by attorneys unless, of course, you've paid to have it reviewed by an attorney, okay? But that's effectively the end of the post-closing occupancy agreement, okay?
I had one question back, Jesse.
Okay.
So I know that on that one where you were talking about water rights and stuff, you can put seller or buyer. It's obviously negotiable.
Yeah.
What's the best avenue?
It's negotiable.
All right. That's what I thought you were going to say. All right.
I mean, to me, it makes sense to have the seller pay, right? Because they're going to be the ones who are living in the property. But if it's going to get transferred anyway, then you're just going to deal with a headache of trying to figure out
how much money,
final bills and everything else, and how do you work that out? So There's no
Right.
right or wrong there. It's not what's better or worse. It's just what works for the parties, right?
Gotcha.
Okay, so any other questions on the post-closing occupancy agreement?
Jesse, I've got one.
Okay.
I know you're not a big fan of them. I'm not myself either. But if you've got the seller, and now the seller's in the driver's seat in this whole market that we're in, how do you typically advise your sellers?
Well, I'm much less a fan of post-closing occupancy agreements from a buyer's perspective, right? There's a lot of risk, particularly the risk associated with what's happening, even though we don't truly have an eviction moratorium per se. It's a de facto moratorium, right? They have lengthened the amount of time that the landlord has to give the tenant. And then even if you've done all that properly, courts are generally not enforcing eviction orders anyway right now. How long is that going to last? I don't know. And so I'm much less a fan of post-closing occupancy agreements from a buyer side. Certainly there are still significant considerations for a seller, right? Like for instance, the whole federal versus state laws. If you know that your seller smokes pot, like what are you supposed to do? Tell them to stop smoking pot? Come on. You really think they're going to stop for 30, 60 days? Like it's just not going to happen, right? And then, maintaining the property, the landscaping, all these other things, there's still things that the seller needs to be aware of, right? And that being said, right, I think from a seller's perspective in particular, I would rather deal with, putting myself in the driver's seat, I would rather deal with a post-closing occupancy agreement than moving twice, right? I don't even like moving once. Moving twice is worse, right? I would rather deal with post-closing occupancy. And so, yes, I'm going to take advantage of it, and I'm going to have to advise my client of it, right? And when I advise my client of it, if they want to take on the risks and whatever else, then fine. There's nothing wrong with that. They just need to know what they're getting into. And the risk that you take as a broker is not properly advising your seller or your buyer as to the terms of the agreement.
Right.
Okay. So if they want to do it, that's fine. Just make sure you're properly advising them and do it.
If they're going to do it, do you basically print out a post-closing occupancy agreement and go through it line by line with them and go, okay, now given all this information, how do you feel?
Well, line by line, not necessarily, because a lot of it's covered in the contract, right?
Right.
A lot of it's similar verbiage and all that other stuff. But certainly the important provisions, right, are the ones that I'm going over with them. And yes, absolutely, I review that with them. I don't spend an hour like we just did on it, but a good 10-minute conversation about it. Hey, here's the risks associated with it. Okay, you need to advise them properly, because if you don't, and an issue comes up, they're going to say, hey, you never told me that I needed to do this. And unless you've got something in writing proving otherwise, who's to say that you did? Okay. Any other questions on post-closing? Okay. So I've had some questions about broker disclosure to buyer in particular. So even though our brokerage firm's policy says that we want you to have an exclusive right to buy when working with a buyer, the law does not necessarily require that. And there are some caveats in our policy even that would allow you to represent a buyer without having an exclusive right to buy. Now, I don't want you to use that as a way to just be lazy and not have to draft an exclusive right to buy. It is absolutely the best protection for you, the best protection for the brokerage, and the safest thing for your commissions, right? And even really the safest thing for the buyer to have an exclusive right to buy. Okay. But short of having an exclusive right to buy, what does Colorado law say our brokerage relationship with the public is by default? What's our
Transaction broker.
Yep, transaction broker, right? The only way that we can become a buyer's agent or a seller's agent would also apply, but that side's going to be a little different. The only way that we can become a buyer's agent is to execute an exclusive right to buy, whereby we check the box at the top of the contract that says buyer's agency. Okay. Now, it is also possible to be a transaction brokerage with an exclusive transaction broker with an exclusive right to buy. You just check the transaction broker box at the top. So I don't want you to fall back on this form and say, oh, this is all I need to be a transaction broker. Well, there are some promises that are made in an exclusive right to buy that are not necessarily present in a brokerage disclosure to buyer. Okay. And so Colorado law, the Brokerage Practice Act license law requires that we disclose at the first reasonable opportunity, and really prior to soliciting any confidential information, we have to disclose our working relationship with the public. Okay. And so the brokerage disclosure to buyer really contains two things. One, it contains the definitions of working relationships. And so if you're using the definitions of working relationships form in conjunction with the brokerage disclosure to buyer, you're doing extra paperwork that you don't need to do. Get rid of the definitions of working relationships. You really don't ever need to use that form because it's covered in the brokerage disclosure to buyer and brokerage disclosure to seller. Okay, that doesn't hurt to have it, but it's redundant. Okay, so the first piece is the definitions, right? It defines, hey, there are different types of working relationships in the state of Colorado: seller's agency, buyer's agency, transaction brokerage, or customer, which is not a brokerage relationship, right? They are just a party to the contract with whom I have not engaged in a brokerage relationship with. Okay, so that's the definitions of working relationships piece right here. It defines them so that they know, hey, what are the types of relationships that exist? Okay, but the important piece that is contained within a brokerage disclosure to buyer that is not in the definitions of working relationships is the actual disclosure and the designation of what my brokerage relationship is going to be. And so what this says is we have not entered into a buyer's agency agreement whereby I would function as your buyer's agent. The working relationship specified below is for a specific property. If it's for a specific property, you could list that here, right? And typically where you would see this is if you're doing an open house at 123 Main Street, right? Then you need to take these brokerage disclosure to buyers with you and, you know, have it filled out. This says 123 Main Street here, okay? Or, you know, if you're meeting with a prospective buyer for the first time in the office, right? You're doing your buyer's consultation with them, and you know, you're talking to them, and they say, well, you know, Liz, this is our first meeting. Like, I'm not really ready to be in an exclusive relationship with you. I'm not ready to get married on the first date. I think I want to work with you, but I want to test out that relationship first and make sure that we're a good fit for each other, right? Well, I still have to disclose what my working relationship is. And if they're not comfortable signing that exclusive right to buy and check that buyer's agency box, then by default, I'm a transaction broker. So I can set myself up as a transaction broker with this form or with the exclusive right to buy. But the exclusive right to buy, if we sign that, they're still entering into an exclusive relationship. And if they don't want to do that, this is the form that says, okay, fine, we're not entering into a buyer's agency agreement, okay? This is not a contract, therefore it is not exclusive. It is simply my disclosure of my working relationship with you as a member of the public. And because I don't know what property you're going to be interested in yet, then I'm just going to put any real property in the state of Colorado here. Or you could put whatever else suits your needs, okay? But when I'm using this, I'm writing any real property in the state of Colorado, okay? And then you come down to the section where you have to check a box, right? And obviously we all work in a multiple person firm, so we're all going to check that multiple person firm box. And then this is where you actually define your relationship, which is missing from simply the definitions of working relationships. And that's why we don't really use that form. Again, you can, it doesn't hurt anything, but it's redundant. Okay. And so this is where you have to define what your relationship is. Well, if you're the listing agent for the seller and you're doing an open house and you have no right to switch into transaction brokerage, then this is the appropriate box to check, saying, hey, I'm going to treat you as a customer. I'm not your agent. I'm also not your transaction broker, right? Really, the only reason that I'm doing this is because I have to disclose my brokerage relationship with the seller to you as a prospective buyer of this property before you start telling me all your confidential info. And then if I've disclosed it to them and then they still dump all that confidential info to me, well, now I can use it against them. Whereas if I have not disclosed my relationship with the seller and they start telling me confidential info, I have to effectively forget that it ever was told to me. And I can't then take it back to my seller, okay? Because otherwise you're opening up a situation where you're probably going to get a complaint from this customer, this person who should have been a customer, who may have thought, oh, by default, you're my transaction broker, or the way you were talking, I thought you were my buyer's agent or something else, right? You need to get something in writing that says, no, I disclosed to you that I am simply treating you as a customer and I am not your agent. I'm not your transaction broker, anything else. My intent is simply to show you this property and potentially prepare and convey written offers, counters, agreements, amend, extend, all those other things, but I'm not your agent. Okay. On the flip side, you might have an instance where they say, hey, okay, that's fine. You can treat me as a customer on this one because of your relationship with the seller. I think I might want to work with you because you had the best cookies at your open house and I love them. So I'd love to work with you on other properties as well, I think, but I'm not ready to sign an exclusive, right? So then you could check this box that says, okay, if you buy this house and everything works out, then I'm going to treat you as a customer. But if you want to work on a different transaction for whatever reason, this one doesn't work out or you don't like it, then okay, I'll be a transaction broker for you, right? If you're not really dealing with an open house guest or something like that, again, this is more like I'm meeting you in the office, then you might check this box, right? And say, okay, I can't be an agent for you until you sign an exclusive right to buy with me. However, by default, I will be a transaction broker for you. Okay. But I'm specifically not your agent. Do those relationships make sense to everybody? Is there any questions on that piece?
Just want to make sure that everybody is, so once you do an exclusive right to buy, it negates this particular disclosure.
Ask that again a different way.
Okay, so let's say we've signed this and we go out and look at a couple houses and they finally say to me, hey, Harry, I really want you to be my
buyer's agent.
Yeah, then
Yeah.
that negates this one, correct?
Yep. So then you would do an exclusive right to buy, check the
Right.
agency box at the top, and then effectively this doesn't go away. You still need it in your file, but
Right. but
you're
it
not
supersedes.
going to, you're not going to treat them as a transaction broker any longer.
Yeah.
You're going to then treat them as a buyer's agent. Yes, that's
Right,
correct.
okay.
Yep. Okay.
But Jesse, what about
Yeah.
if you have a listing and they want you to represent them? You'd have to be a transaction broker on both ends. But if they decide they don't want that home and they want you to represent them as an exclusive right to buy, then
As an agent.
Yep. How does that work?
Well, so a couple things. One is your listing agreement with the seller is going to dictate how what options you have with respect to representing buyers, right? That you may have a box checked in your exclusive right to, in your exclusive right to sell, rather. Your exclusive right to sell with the seller will dictate what options you have with the buyer. And so if you have the box checked that says seller's agency only, then you don't have a right to switch into transaction brokerage. Now, maybe that gets negotiated and you can do a listing contract amend extend to change that. However, unless the seller is willing to sign that amendment, you don't have the option to switch into transaction brokerage. Your only option may be to treat them as a customer on that particular deal, right? And then if that one doesn't work out, then they want to buy something else and say, hey, Angela, we really like you, even though that one didn't work out. We do want you to be an agent, a buyer's agent for us. Then you would just do an exclusive right to buy at that point, right? And this goes away because this had to do with that particular property, okay? And then you treat them as an agent. Well, what happens if you're an agent for the seller? You have no right to switch into transaction brokerage, and they go, hey, Angela, we really want someone to have a brokerage relationship with us. We don't want to be treated as a customer. We really want to be treated as by someone as a buyer's agent.
Is that a question?
Yeah, not just for you. This is for everybody, right? What do you do? Now you've got a buyer who wants to be treated, who wants a buyer's agent to represent them. You've got a seller who says, I want you to be my seller's agent. What are you supposed to do?
Can you do a referral?
Yeah, you call me up and say, hey, Jesse, I need you to do this for 50%. No, I'm kidding. Talk to somebody else, right? But yeah, refer it out, right? That's your option. You cannot be a dual agent. You also cannot be an agent for the seller and a transaction broker for the buyer. You also can't be an agent for the buyer and a transaction broker for the seller, right? You can't do that. So your only option is then to refer it out if they both want to have an agency agreement or agency relationship, or if one of them wants a transaction brokerage relationship and the other party is insisting that you have an agency agreement, right? The one potential caveat there is you could theoretically terminate your agreement with your seller to treat them as a for sale by owner, where you treat them as a customer and then represent the buyer as a buyer's agent. But that is a really awkward thing that probably is not very, that's not a very good thing to do. And there's a lot of risk and liability associated with doing that. So if you think that's a good idea, come talk to me first and I'll tell you why it's not. Okay. That makes sense? Yep.
Hey, Jesse.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, what if you were at an open house and a person comes in and they have this signed as a transaction broker with another agent? They're like, yeah, we're not jiving with this other agent. We would like you to be our exclusive right to buy. Like, how is there a termination that they need to do with that other agent, or vice versa? If you have one,
good question. Yeah. So a couple things. One is if the other broker is treating them as a transaction broker, and the only way that they've established that is with this brokerage disclosure to buyer and not an exclusive right to buy, then this is not a contract, right? They have no obligation to work with the other broker. Even if the other broker gave them one of these, it doesn't mean that it's an exclusive relationship. Okay.
Okay.
You have every right to then go sign an exclusive right to buy, or give them your own brokerage disclosure to buyer that says, hey, I'll treat you as a transaction broker unless and until you're ready to sign an exclusive right to buy with an agency relationship, right? You have every right to do that. Now, what I don't ever want is I don't ever want you to have a copy or even look at forms that were prepared by another broker, right? And so if they say, hey, I signed something with this other broker, but I don't know if I'm obligated to work with them. Could you take a look at it for me? I don't care whether it's a broker disclosure to buyer or an exclusive right to buy or anything else. The answer is no. Right? You need to figure that out on your own. You can either go talk to an attorney to figure out if you still have some obligation to the other broker, or you can sign my form and know that if you do have some type of obligation to the other broker, that you may potentially be on the hook for 2 commissions. Okay. It is important that we are not interpreting other forms from other brokers, because inevitably what's going to happen is they're going to say, hey, Danielle, I've got this brokerage disclosure to buyer, right? And it says that they were going to represent me as a transaction broker, but it says that this is not a contract. Can I just sign an agreement with you, right? And you look this over and you go, okay, yeah, it's not an exclusive relationship. So, yep, you can sign an agreement with me. No problem, no harm, no foul, right? And you think everything's all fine and good. And then you close on a property several weeks after closing. Their former agent sends you a letter on letterhead from their attorney that says, hey, we're demanding the commission in this deal. We had an exclusive right to buy with this client, and therefore we are entitled to compensation.
Oh crap.
Oh crap. Right? That's not good. And that's why we don't ever want to interpret those forms, because the only reason you would do that is to either tell them, hey, yeah, you still have obligations, or you don't. Well, by looking at this one form doesn't present the whole picture. And I'll never have the full picture of what happens to the other side. I can never make an informed decision about whether you have obligations to your other broker or not. And so, no, I'm not going to advise you on this form or any other form that you've written. It is outside the scope of a broker's authority to interpret forms, even if they are a standard form, if they are written by another brokerage. Now, the obvious caveat there is that if they've written an offer on your listing, then yes, you obviously have the right to do that. But when it comes to an exclusive right to buy, a broker's disclosure to buyer, anything else, I don't know. They either need to go talk to their other broker and make sure that they're comfortable with it. They need to talk to an attorney to make sure that the attorney has advised them properly, or they need to sign my agreement and know that they may potentially be on the hook for 2 commissions if they really had, some kind of continuing obligation with the other broker.
So that would be, so at that point, it would be good to talk to them and be like, would you like me to talk to the agent you've been working with and break the news to them that you'd rather work with me rather than them, and find out if they do have the exclusive or not?
I would rather have them do it, right? Because what happens if the other broker says, hey, Danielle, yeah, no problem. Like, you're more than welcome to work with them. Do you believe them?
No, or you just talk to them and ask them if they would like, maybe not offer it, but if they ask you for a 25% referral.
Well, but the problem is, if they don't have an exclusive relationship anyway, they can ask you for a referral all day long. It doesn't mean that they're entitled to it. Right?
Right.
So again, I would rather just have them talk to the other broker or talk to an attorney, right? Or if they say, no, I'm positive, I don't need to talk to the other broker, I don't need to talk to an attorney, then just make sure you put something in writing that says, okay, hey, you kind of had mentioned that you may have signed a broker disclosure to buyer. I'm kind of operating on your insistence that you don't have an exclusive relationship with another broker, and if you do, just know that you may be liable to both of us, right? And then you've advised them, and if they choose to move forward anyway, then they can do that. There's nothing wrong with them doing that. Now, there is something wrong doing that if you know that they have an exclusive right to buy in place that is not expired, then that's a problem. But if you don't know that because they haven't told you that, or they misled you about it, or whatever, you can't avoid something you don't know, right?
Right.
So I would just rather have them do it, or talk to an attorney, or know that they're taking on the risk if they in fact do have some type of continuing obligation. That being said, if this form was what was used and this is it, then no, they have no continuing obligation to work with that broker.
Now I have another question.
Okay.
what you know about this situation. So I was let go by a client, and I don't know if they had signed with the other agent before we had terminated ours. How is there a way to find out?
Well, I mean, you could certainly file a lawsuit to, I mean, first you'd have to go probably through our arbitration through the Board of Realtors, right? And if that doesn't work out, then you could proceed with litigation. We can't force another brokerage to turn over documents to us. We don't have subpoena power, whereas the courts do. And so it's very difficult to determine that. And in most cases, it just doesn't make sense based on the dollar amount, particularly in the, your particular situation, which we talked about. And just to clue everybody else in, it was a mobile home where, it was like $30,000 mobile home or something. The commission was going to be, $300 or whatever. Like there was no point in fighting anything on that one. If you're talking about
Right.
a $1 million house, right, then maybe it makes sense to do some digging, take the thing to court where the court can subpoena documents and figure out, okay, did this broker, knowingly sign an agreement, knowing that there was another agreement in place. If they didn't, then they may not have any liability, but that seller may still have liability to you, right? If they sold or if they sold the property in conjunction with the terms of your contract that was not expired, that was not terminated, whatever else, right?
Gotcha.
So very difficult for us to determine, hey, did they sign something with another broker? It's hard to say.
Is there an official form to terminate a agreement or like a agency agreement?
Nope. So you just do an listing contract amend extend. And in there's some verbiage that we can put in there. And effectively that verbiage just says, hey, we're mutually agreeing to terminate this thing. We're releasing each other of all obligations and liabilities and all that other stuff. So I can get you that verbiage if you come across the need for it at some point. So just let me know. But there is no termination of a listing agreement form. It's just a listing contract amendment. Okay.
But before you do that, make sure you talk to Jesse or someone. This is just from experience, before you do the termination, because there might be a way for you to get some referral out of it.
Yeah. Yep. A lot of times, if that's what's going on, is they want to work with someone else, right? Like the way that this typically happens is they sign an agreement with you, right? And then they realize like, oh man, my best friend is in real estate and I forgot about them and whatever, right? And it's like, well, you don't have a right to get out of my contract because your mom just got her real estate license or your friend got her real estate license or whatever, right? But we may be able to, from a PR perspective, we may not want to force our agreement with them, but if nothing else, we may be able to secure a referral agreement out of it, whereby we say, hey, we will terminate this upon receiving a referral agreement from whoever your new broker is in an amount of 25% or 40 or 50% or whatever it is. Right. So if you get into a weird situation, just call me and we'll walk you through everything, see if we can get you taken care of. Okay.
If they've just decided like not to buy at this time for whatever reason, is it almost easier to just let it expire?
Well, yeah, because I would rather just let it expire as opposed to terminate it, because if you terminate it, then they could just say, they could lie to you and say, hey, we just decided we're not going to buy. So, let's just terminate, right? And you terminate, and then tomorrow they go sign a listing or they go sign a buyer's agreement with some other broker, right? I would rather just let it expire. And then they're still under the terms of the listing agreement. So are you as the broker, right? So you can't abandon them during that process, or else you violated your terms. But I would rather still at least have something in place in writing, just in case they're lying to me about it or whatever, that they can't just kick me out of the deal and go use, their buddy who just got their license or whatever. Okay.
So I guess in my particular situation that had happened was the lady decided she wasn't going to buy in Colorado anymore and was probably going to move from her place in a year. So at that point, we essentially exchanged an email, and I said, so, I want to get this straight. You want me to not actively search for places for you currently, and if you change your mind. So since that's in writing, I'm not abandoning her, but I'm essentially letting her give me permission not to actively search.
Yeah, so really the best thing to do from a protection standpoint to protect yourself is, if that's going to be the agreement, then you could still do a listing contract amend extend that just says, hey, buyer, you've decided not to pursue a property, during the term of this agreement. You've agreed that I'm not going to be searching properties for you or whatever. Is that a little bit overkill? Yeah, it probably is. But at least that way you're not terminating that agreement so that they can go work with someone else. But you're also saying, hey, I'm not going to do the things that we had previously agreed to either. And we're documenting that in writing, right? And then get their signature on it. Does an email work? I don't know. I mean, an email could theoretically get brought into a court case if it ever went to court. But if they're not going to buy, there's no sense taking it to court, right? So it's probably overkill, but that is really, if you want to do it textbook, then do a listing contract amend extend that just memorializes whatever your agreement is going to be, but doesn't terminate the contract. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. So one of the important pieces here, right, is that it says the buyer. So keep in mind, right, that let's say that you have an agency relationship with the seller, and now you've come in and you've either checked customer or you've checked customer for brokers listings and transaction brokerage for other properties. Now there's this disclaimer to the buyer, right? And it says buyer consents to my disclosure of their confidential information. Now that I've disclosed this, right, if they now start disclosing confidential info, then they consent to me disclosing that confidential information to supervising broker, well, yada, yada. And even though it doesn't say it there, to the seller. Okay. Now, if it's transaction brokerage only, then you can't disclose confidential information from one party to the other, right? We have to be a neutral party between buyer and seller. Okay. But if you're going to treat them as a customer and you've disclosed that you're a customer, that you're treating them as a customer, and that you've got an agency relationship with the seller, I'm working on their behalf, and they want to start telling you, oh, here's our situation, here's our motivations, here's everything else, use it against them. You've done your duty. You've disclosed your brokerage relationship with the seller. You've disclosed that you're treating them as a customer. And if they want to spill the beans, then let them go for it. Okay. But prior to disclosing that, if they start talking about motivations and everything else, either forget that you heard it or say, hey, I got to stop you. You're starting to talk about these confidential information and motives and whatever else. I have a brokerage relationship with the seller. I have their best interest in mind, right? So I need to disclose to you that I am their agent, right? I can only treat you as a customer, or I can switch into transaction brokerage for both, right? But just want to make sure you are aware of that before you start disclosing your motives to me, okay? Let's see. Disclosure settlement costs. So obviously there's different levels of service and costs associated with attorneys, lenders, inspectors, title companies, and whoever else. Okay. This is not a contract. Again, it is simply the legal requirement for me to disclose my brokerage relationship with you. Okay. If it's a residential transaction, then this gets included as well. Hey, if you're worried about sex offenders, then you can go contact local law enforcement, but I have no obligation to disclose, the fact that the neighbor might be a registered sex offender, or down the street might be a registered sex offender, or anything else. Okay. And then buyer acknowledges receipt of this document on whatever day you give it to them, their names and signatures. And then this is your acknowledgement. Hey, on this date, I gave these people this document via a hard copy in person, electronic copy via email, however you gave it to them, and then you retained a copy for your records and you sign it. Okay. Any questions about brokerage disclosure to buyer or brokerage relationships or anything else? Okay. That's all I got for you. Next. So last week we had mentioned we do a special class. We did that for Castle Rock and Colorado Springs, but we wanted to advertise it more heavily for the northern classes, or for the northern offices. So for you in the northern offices, I think May 7th is going to be the rescheduled date, and that will be 12 to 2. So sorry for the swap there on you, but May 7th from 12 to 2 is what we're going to do. And you'll see that blasted out. But for next week for contracts, what we'll probably do is attorney drafted clauses unless someone else has something pressing that they want to go over. If you're in the Castle Rock office and you were on the call yesterday, it will largely be a review of many of the clauses that we went over. So you can come or not come, whatever, doesn't matter. Not gonna make me mad by any means, but we'll do contracts next week. We'll probably do attorney drafted clauses unless someone else has something that they need. So, all right. Okay, that's all I got for you guys. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll
Thank
see
you,
you.
Jesse.
Thanks,
All right, bye.
Jesse.
You bet.